morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are around the world. My name is Suzanne Moser, and I'm a senior advisor to the International Science Council's Transformation to Sustainability program. It's my great pleasure to moderate this webinar today and to see such continued great interest with more than 380 registrants to this event. So thank you all for joining. This virtual session is convened by UNESCO's Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission in partnership with the International Science Council as part of the Ocean Decade virtual series, which is a series of high-level scientific virtual dialogues aimed at fostering innovation in solutions-oriented research and really to form transformative and sustained partnerships during the Ocean Decade. Of course, it begins next year, but the planning is fully underway, and this is all part of that. Today's session is entitled Co-Designing the Science We Need for the Ocean Decade. It aims to mobilize the global ocean research community around advancing transdisciplinary solutions-oriented ocean research for this decade, what we really think of as a transformation in ocean science. And this, some of you may have been to regional webinars or to the first global webinar. This is the closing session of this series that we've had. And we'll hear a little bit more in a moment about what we learned in this decade, during these sessions. Here's an overview of who is here. Many of you were part of the global introductory session, so do not despair. This is not a repeat. This is actually a deepening and extension of that. Many of you also participated in the different regional sessions, so thank you for coming to this. And in terms of how familiar, this is wonderful to hear that many of you are very or somewhat familiar already to the goals of the Ocean Decade. We'll hear a lot more about that over the course of this session. I just quickly wanted to give you an overview of what we're doing today, this sort of arc of our talk. We're gonna, just as a reminder and as a common language creator, if you will, have a briefer session in the beginning that looks at what is co-design and what is transdisciplinary science, just to get us all on the same page. We'll hear a little bit about these webinars, the regional ones, and what came out of them, what recommendations come forward. And then we also are going to hear about methodologies for engagement and the roles of researchers in transdisciplinary science. And we have just a stellar lineup for that. Gabrielle Bemmer from the Australian National University is going to do that introduction. Dylan McGarry from Rhodes University is going to speak about methodologies and the role of researchers. And Julie Rigaud, who organized this entire session, thank you, Julie, so much for all your work. She's also going to speak to us about what came out of the regional webinars. So then in part two, we're gonna dive deep into one of the key issues that came out of them, which is how do we actually recognize the complementarities and integrate different knowledge systems and to support effective interactions with a talk about one particular project that is in the middle of doing that, and then a moderated expert panel with amazing speakers who I will introduce in a moment. And then in the third part, we will talk about another key issue that emerged out of the regional webinar series, and that is how to build capacity and mobilize the necessary resources for doing co-design and co-production, a question many of you have raised and are interested in. And we're going to close that panel with a lesson learned, if you will, from the Transformations to Sustainability program, ISC's program, that has just been amazingly well designed to do exactly that, of providing the resources and building capacity to produce transformative science. And quite frankly, I think has been transformative in its impact. And then close with next steps in closing. So that just as an overview, and now we're gonna jump into this first session with not much introduction. It's all about laying that foundation of what do we mean by co-design and what recommendations came out of the regional sessions. Julie, if you could launch us into this first video where Gabrielle Bemmer is introducing why we need co-design and transdisciplinary research to get at some of the complex science questions we have around the oceans. So if you could start that, that would be great.
So thank you very much for the opportunity to join you in this important webinar to talk about the importance of co-design. What I want to talk about is 6 elements that make problems complex and that effectively tackling them needs expertise in working across disciplines and with stakeholders. And in terms of stakeholders, what we're talking about is those who are affected by the problem and those who are in a position to do something about it. For the 6 elements, the first is that complex problems are systems problems, which means that everything's connected. And it means that there are no natural boundaries to the problem, but the boundary can go on forever. And so we have to set artificial boundaries to make problems studyable and understandable and tackleable. Diversity is important. So different people are going to see the problem differently. They're going to have different interests around the problem. They're going to have different values around the problem. That the problem exists in a constantly changing environment, and so we have to understand that the problem is always changing all the time as we try and work on it, and that if we want to make change happen, we've got to dive into this change environment and try to maneuver it in particular ways. That context is important, so that the history of the problem, the politics, the economics of the problem, the cultural aspects of the problem, they're all important in how we understand it and can act on it. And that finally, that we can never know everything about a problem. Even if every man, woman and child became a researcher, we still couldn't know everything. And unknowns are important because they lead to adverse unintended consequences and nasty surprises, as well as sometimes pleasant surprises. You can tell that those are only 5 elements, and the 6th is a consequence of the other 5, and it's imperfection. It's the fact that we can never have perfect answers to complex problems, and we can only ever have trade-offs so that we can do better, and what we're doing is looking for the best possible trade-offs. So let me talk a little about imperfection and diversity, because in co-design, what we're trying to do is to integrate different problem definitions, different mental models about the problem, different interests, different values, different ways of doing research, etc., etc. And it means that there's no perfect integration, because not all differences can be reconciled, and we have to think about how we can deal with that. So when we're talking about integration, it's useful to think about 2 things. One is, what are the tools that we can use for integration? And the other is, what can we do to manage irreconcilable differences? I'd argue that there are 3 important classes of integrative tools. The first is dialogue, both formal and informal methods. So formal methods include things like nominal group technique and appreciative inquiry. The second class of methods is modelling, which is useful not only for understanding the problem, but for identifying leverage points and places to interact or intervene on the problem. And participatory modelling, which works across disciplines and with a range of stakeholders, is a great way of integrating that diversity that we've been talking about. The final class of methods I'd call common metric, and this is about turning everything into the same metric or variable so that the integration becomes a matter of arithmetic, if you like. So money is a useful common metric. Ecological services is one that's founded on similar principles. Global footprint is another common metric, and there are a range of others. In terms of ways of managing irreconcilable differences, the first thing is to understand that we're different, and often differences or that the irritation can disappear when we understand that the person that we're finding quite annoying is not setting out to annoy us, but they just view the world differently from the way that we do. An important tool for different interests is principled negotiation, or negotiation on the merits, or looking for a win-win solution. But we really don't have very many ways of managing irreconcilable differences, and these are an area that really need development. It's also important to say that co-design is not always suitable, and there's some great work that's been done by the International Association for Public Participation, which I've adapted for a research context that says there are different ways that you can interact with stakeholders in particular, and you need to do what's most appropriate for the problem that you're working on and the situation in which you're working, and what's feasible in your situation. And so anything from informing to empowering can be useful. The important part of their design is that it's not just about extracting things from stakeholders, but that you're also making a promise back to them, a promise to keep them informed, a promise to work with them in a particular way, a promise of working with them not only on the problem, but also on the implementation of change. And so thinking about it, that's really an important part of co-design, is that it's a two-way relationship. So I guess I want to finish by talking about what do we call this style of research and this kind of expertise that I've been talking about. There are a range of terms for the style of research in this series of webinars that you've been having around the future of oceans. You've been using the term transdisciplinarity, and it's a really good term. Some people use interdisciplinarity to mean the same thing, or some people use it to mean something different. Others, people talk about sustainability science or systems thinking or operations research. There are a whole range of terms that people use for dealing with complex problems. And in terms of expertise, I'd argue that there's an underpinning expertise regardless of what you call the style of research, which I'd suggest could be termed integration and implementation sciences. And I've made a case for developing a discipline that works with people to really be able to deal with complexity effectively. So in conclusion, I want to say that it's not just the oceans that need you. We also need to work together to build the expertise, the scholarship, and a strong alliance, which is a political activity, for this kind of research that tackles complexity by working across disciplines and with stakeholders. And again, just a reminder that stakeholders are those affected by the problem and those in a position to do something about it. On the last slide, I've listed some resources. There's a blog that I run, the Integration and Implementation Insights blog, which is really trying to build this expertise and community. And I'd be thrilled if you would contribute to it in terms of what you learn about co-design, transdisciplinarity, and all those related things in your work. I've pointed you to a couple of toolkits, a range of professional associations and networks that do this kind of work, and the references that I've used in this PowerPoint. Thank you very much.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Gabrielle Bemmer, who couldn't be with us because it is in the deep dark night in Australia. So thank you for that. And her resources at the end here just reminded me that I want to make two comments. One is that we're making all these resources available, on the website for the Ocean Decade. They should be already listed. If not, they will be there shortly, so you can access them. And we might also post some in the chat during this webinar. But if you have questions, obviously to the people who give us videos, we can't ask them questions right now. But if you have questions to the panelists later, please type them in the Q&A function, not in the chat, just because it's easier for us to keep track. If you just want to comment, share something, put that in the chat, that's fine. But the Q&A is where if you have questions to any of the panelists later, please put them there. Now I want to turn to Julie Rigaud, who is with the Ocean Decade team. She is behind all this and has co-organized all the regional webinars. And Julie, tell us a little bit about what came out of those meetings in terms of the needs to make this kind of science happen.
Thank you, Susie, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Following the global opening session that was held in September, the IOC, the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, co-organized with relevant partners 6 regional sessions from October to November 2020. These regional sessions gathered more than 1,200 participants with a good geographical, gender, and sectoral balance. These experts identifies some challenges in doing transdisciplinary research, which are that the stakeholders have different values and expectations, that they speak different language, and that's particularly the case in certain regions, that participating requires an investment of time, commitment, and money, that they are facing unequal resources, financial and human, and that we have to give value to transdisciplinary research. Oops. These experts formulated the following recommendations on how we can build and maintain participation in collaborative approaches. It requires the establishment of common goal, identify common research priorities, and to define the expectations early in the project, and evaluate and communicate clearly the positive impacts for all parties and the potential benefits. It is also important to develop clear roles for different stakeholders and expected investment. And it is also important to involve all stakeholders, private sector, the users, decision makers, civil society, academics, NGOs, who must be solicited at different stage of the scientific research conception, design, production, and delivery. They also stress the need for respecting the rights of all stakeholders and developing mutual respect that allows social learning, and to develop principles of good governance underlie trust among different stakeholders. And the most important principles are inclusivity and fairness. The projects need to be inclusive of geographies, sectors, culture, age, and gender. And traditional and local knowledge need to be integrated into the knowledge systems, as they provide long-term site-specific and daily observation that are otherwise unattainable. The role of youth and young professionals is also going to be critical to advance this transformative change. And it is also important to identify and acknowledge baseline inequalities and ensuring that they are addressed while doing transdisciplinary research. And finally, to build on the existing networks and shared practical experience. You can see on the screen some of the challenges and recommendations that were formulated during this virtual sessions, regional session. And I will go through the different sessions, but will not go into too much details. For the Southern Ocean, one of the challenges that were identified was the very high cost associated with conducting research. And one of the recommendations was that we will need to strengthen international collaboration with a coordinated survey and reorganize the research institute in order to adapt to the changing scientific climate. The challenges for the Arctic, the experts identified a conflict of interest between the private sector and research institutes, and recommended, one of the recommendations was the establishment of a truly international Arctic research program that would overcome several challenges, especially when it comes to funding. The regional session for Africa identified the absence of legally binding framework and the tools to implement it, as well as the shortcoming of technical infrastructure and financial resources as hampering the conduct of exhaustive co-design research. And the experts recommended to develop training and university programs, employment, and internship perspectives. The recommendations of the Western Tropical Atlantic workshop was to encourage and develop an inventory of existing and missing capacities, including formal and informal education platforms, as well as soft skills like communication and community engagement. The challenges for the Southeast Pacific remain the baseline inequalities, considering that in the region, coastal settlements tend to be extremely poor and marginalized. And the Southeast Pacific expert highlighted the role of research centers as a conduit to bridge the science policy interface and recognize their benefits. They also play a role in the formal education of ocean professionals and general awareness of the public. The virtual session for the Mediterranean highlighted the lack of local marine ecological knowledge as one of the challenges, given that the scientific papers published by scholars aren't available online. And they suggested to strengthening the cooperation between the developed and developing Mediterranean countries to moderate the two-speed sustainable development and improve the transboundary collaboration using the structure supported by European Union actions in the Mediterranean. These virtual sessions resulted in the production of a series of short regional discussion paper, and you will that will be posted on the Decade website in the upcoming weeks. And we will have 2 additional virtual sessions for the North Atlantic, the 10th of November, and for the Eastern Tropical Pacific. And the results and the outputs of these regional sessions will be included in a final report that will be elaborated and published yearly next year in January. And the objectives here is to support the Decade partners as Decade actions are designed and delivered with the launch of the first call for action, and also to inform the ongoing reflections among stakeholders involved in these existing and the regional partnerships that have recently been established. Thank you, Susie.
Thank you very much, Julie. That's great to hear, and actually is a great setup for our next video presentation, again by someone who can't be here at the moment, but you'll enjoy it quite a bit, in part because it answers one of the questions, or the two questions that have come in so far, which have to do with emotional intelligence, how to deal with people's emotions and values in a deep manner, if you will, as part of the work that we do in transdisciplinary projects. Dylan McGarry is a senior researcher at the Environmental Learning Research Center at Rhodes University in South Africa, where he co-leads the One Ocean Hub and uses a very creative engagement methodology called Empatheater. And you can hear that emotional component of it, Empatheater, in a newly formed Coastal Justice Knowledge Action Network. If you want to learn more about it, there will be links to both the One Ocean Hub and the Empatheater in the chat and posted online. Until recently, Dylan was part of the T-Learning, or Transformative Knowledge Action Knowledge Network that was part of the ISC's Transformations to Sustainability program. One of those 3 programs that ISC funded. In that project, he and his colleagues developed some incredibly creative methodologies for engaging partners in research projects. And so he will speak to us in this video about the different roles that researchers may play as they take this really seriously, how to engage in new and creative ways with societal partners. Each one of them has profound implications for the methodologies we use for engagement. So with that introduction, let's see what he sent by video.
Hi, my name's Dr. Dylan McGarry from the Environmental Learning Research Center in South Africa. I am sharing today some work we've done looking at the different roles and responsibilities of researchers in contemporary time, particularly around research for development or scholar activism or pracademia. So just to share, the Transgressive Learning Research Network was very interested in this idea of plural forms of knowing around the boundary crossing work that's needed to happen in research today, and also for the ways in which we're having to develop new generative approaches to research. We worked in various contexts in the Global South and in the North, in 9 countries, and these are the 9 countries. And then our sister network, Acknowledge, also worked in 6 different countries. But today I really wanted to look at this idea of moving from more academic, not just focusing on academic rigor, but also the idea of political rigor, which we got the concept from Boras, and then further developed it in this paper and a methodology, a social learning methodology. And it really looks at this idea of the ethical guidelines currently used by universities may be inadequate to address questions of political rigor. And this idea for ongoing, reflexive, iterative, and co-developed meaning making in our research is critical. So yeah, it means being politically informed and thorough and sensitive and nuanced and timely and relevant in your work. We looked at this concept of tarot and trying to create a tool in which we could practice forms of political rigor and iterative, reflexive ethics making and reflexive justice. So through Acknowledge mainly, we were able to facilitate a learning process with all the activists that form part of the academic activists for co-production of knowledge for environmental justice. And this was one of the projects we did in Lebanon. And people were able to kind of frame and start exploring the kinds of roles and responsibilities they're having to play. And we use collage as one of the art making processes. And so from this, we were able to develop a methodology, Leah, Lena, and I, and we were able to take it to other countries. We facilitated this in Colombia, in Canada, in South Africa, and in India, and Spain. And from these findings, we were able to develop this paper. So this is the paper. You can find it on Ecological Economics. And we identify in this paper 7 different kind of archetypes. This is by no means an exhaustive list. There's many, many more, but it's just to demonstrate the different types of roles. And since publishing this paper, we've identified many more and aim to create an actual deck of cards that will have, it's kind of a game that you can play for a kind of a reflexive process in thinking about your ethics and political rigor in your research. But these are just some of them. The first in the paper is the post-normal scientist, which is kind of this need that we're having to venture into the unknown and move kind of beyond our boundaries and limits. And what does that mean for researchers now? So there's the post-normal scientist, or the fool. There's the indigenous scholars who teach us how we can do research in culturally embedded ways, and what we need to unlearn and let go of to do kind of more decolonial research, and what it means to not just give voice, because we can't give voice, people have voices already, but what does it mean to be a researcher that can create a platform in which voices can be heard? So it's very much about allyship. Then there's the eccentric or anti-oppressive researcher, which kind of brings focus towards positionality and power relationships within your research. And the relationships, the kind of relationality and reflexivity that's needed. This was very much driven by queer theory and a lot of queer researchers. Then there's the co-conspirer, which was very much inspired by the work of Njaro Kulundu, who's been developing a critical African pedagogy, liberatory pedagogy in South African education for social and environmental justice. And she realized as a researcher that she was more of a co-conspirer, that she was deeply immersed and often implicated in the movements that she was working with. And what does that mean for the ethics and the political rigor needed? And also in the development of counter-hegemonic research methodologies. Then there was the responsible participant, which was driven very much from my PhD research and postdoctoral research around kind of embodied practice and what it means to be a responsible participant in not just in society, but also in facilitating research also research that might be interventionist, and how does one practice that? Looking at questions of parity, reflexivity, empathy, and creative practice. There's the critical comrade, who looks at both the synergies and potential tensions and works very much as a comrade, but is also able to point out blind spots with kindness and with care. We can often get critiques that don't do that with kindness and care, and it's a very delicate space, and we must also recognize the huge amount of emotional labor it takes to be a researcher in social and environmental justice processes and in transdisciplinary processes, particularly because it is so existential. Then there's the slow and careful scholar, and I know I'm rushing through this presentation to be within 5 minutes, but just to say that the importance of taking things slow and carefully and building caring relationships, and also to be careful with the demands of the neoliberal university, and how does one take care of one's own mental and physical health. These are the two projects that developed this paper, Acknowledge and the Transgressive Learning Network, and I highly recommend you check out both websites.
Great. So that's the end of that. And, you know, Dylan mentioned he had to rush. If you want to read up more on these or view it again, both videos that we heard this morning are going to be posted on the event website. And also there's a document with the bios of all the speakers, and it has all the links to those resources that are mentioned. So just to repeat that. Now let's dive into this second panel here, which is all about how do we integrate different knowledge systems, how do we recognize how they're complementary, and how do we support effective interactions. We have, to kick us off, a brief presentation by Sheila Heymans, who is the Executive Director of the Ocean Marine Board. Let me speak in a moment to this slide here, just introduce Sheila for a moment. She will share with us an experience she had with knowledge integration in a transdisciplinary project called the SOPHI project. But if you can just go back to that slide before that. When I think about knowledge integration, different knowledge systems that have to come together, it is often discussed with different language. Co-design can sometimes be the entire process of working together across the entire research project, from design all the way to implementation. Sometimes it's just that first phase, if you will, where we listen to different voices, jointly identify what is the shared matter of concern, and then shape the research questions, which then get addressed by researchers. But sometimes even in that knowledge co-production, we are engaged with people from different disciplines, different backgrounds, different sectors. So we might actually do some co-production and then deliver the results, make meaning out of what we found, and implement the resulting actions together. So really, it's the entire spectrum we're talking about here. And I think, Sheila, in your experience, you're really still relatively early in that co-design process. So take it away, tell us about your work.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Suzanne. You can go to the next slide, please. And the next slide, actually. Just a brief introduction about the European Marine Board. The Marine Board, we're a partnership organization of oceanographic institutes, research funding agencies, and national networks of universities. And we have 35 members across Europe. And basically what we do in general is put together all of the marine science in Europe in a way that policymakers can understand. So that's also some sort of form of co-design. But specifically in this document that you'll see on the left-hand side here, Marine Science for a Sustainable Future, that's our flagship publication. And transdisciplinary science came out very strongly as one of the things that is very desperately needed in Europe for marine science. So if you go to the next slide, one of the ways that where we've actually implemented and worked through this is in this project called SOPHI. So it sees oceans and public health in Europe. And obviously Europe, the oceans I don't have to tell you guys, you're all here for the Ocean Decade. Europe has a very large ocean environment. It's very important for the people who live close to it. Half the population lives close, 50 kilometers from the coast. The ocean economy supports a lot of jobs and a lot of finance. But obviously the ocean has some risks like storms, climate change, harmful algal blooms and so forth. But there's also benefits like the health and well-being that you can get from the coast, seafood and so forth. Next slide, please. So in this project, SOPHIE, which is Seas, Oceans and Public Health Europe, with a slide to change, I'm just waiting. In this project, we basically brought together a lot of different stakeholders across Europe. So it was a very diverse network of stakeholders. And in this specific project, we looked at oceans and human health. And the outcome of what we needed to get to at the end was to develop a strategic research agenda for oceans and human health. And of course, we needed to create a legacy beyond the project. So if you can go to the next slide, please. We obviously had multiple partners, which were some environmentalists, some ocean science, some medical well-being and so forth. And in the project, the whole purpose of the project was to listen to different voices. So we did some interviews, public interviews, surveys and so forth. We brought medical and public health scientists together with the marine science community and the tourism community in stakeholder meetings where we were trying to actually think of what would be the strategic research needs for oceans and human health. We also incorporated the policymakers in that, and then came to a strategic research agenda, which is then given to the funding bodies. So next slide, please. So basically, in these meetings that we had, we had, as I said, we spanned both the marine community and the health communities, and we specifically. I remember being in these workshops, and the first day of these workshops was just trying to figure out what the other people are talking about. And I think anybody who's ever worked in this cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary ways that knows that you have to be able to understand that your jargon is not the same as their jargon, and that what is obvious to you is not obvious to them. And we also had some workshops with stakeholders across Europe, so not just these specific kind of experts, but normal stakeholders, where we looked at what the challenges and opportunities they thought were for oceans and human health. And so this consultative process was basically part of the whole SOPHIE program. It was all about actually listening to stakeholders. So next slide, please. In the graphic, until the next slide comes, you would have seen, and you can see if you look back to it, all the different ways we looked at stakeholders. So in the end, as I said, we created a strategic research agenda, and actually it's not really that important what the strategic research that we came up with are about. Blue spaces and tourism, sustainable seafood and so forth, marine biodiversity and medicine. These things are important, but what was more important was the fact that we got 20 interdisciplinary international experts together at these two workshops and basically work together to understand how, not just how the science is different in marine science versus health versus well-being, but also how the policy drivers are different. For instance, that anybody who knows anything about COVID in Europe knows that most of our medical sciences happens at a national level, whereas all of the policy on marine science happens at a European level. So there's just, from a policy perspective, huge differences in drivers. And that you can go to the next slide, please. So basically what we did is then putting together this strategic research agenda to address the short-term goals. And of course, it had to address both health and oceans. It had to be linked to the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. And then across all of these, there was equity and equality, sustainability, global change, so climate change and pollution was always a driver. You can go to the next slide, please. And of course, ocean literacy and citizen science and innovation and employment was always important. And one of the things that came out of it is really, if you want to have transdisciplinary science, you're going to have to fund it, because you can't expect the national funders who fund in silos to be able to fund these trans and interdisciplinary science. And it's probably going to need international funding. So the conclusions that we came up with when we wrote this policy document was basically that the funding is really needed. transdisciplinary training is really needed, because you can't just expect science people who have been trained in silos to be able to do this. And we really need to co-create, not just with the communities, but the businesses, NGOs, and so forth. Next slide. And then I think the next slide, as it comes up, really one of the things that came out of it is that we did a webinar for the Ocean Decade on oceans and human health. And in that webinar, there was actually I don't know if that slide has disappeared, but anyway, there were some global voices, and you can really go back. There we go. The global voices are there. If you're interested in this in more detail, then you can go to this webinar, which is on this YouTube link. And there are some global voices that really explains how oceans and human health is different for lawyers versus natural scientists and so forth. And then I think the final slide is basically just explaining one of the examples of where we think it's actually working well. And that is, no, still the next slide. Maybe it's not there anymore, but there is an oceans and human health chair that was created at the University of Girona. And you know, that's really a transdisciplinary way that is actually working. And so if you're interested in anything more about this, then you can have a look at this, the website that's on this slide now. And I think with that, I will end.
Thank you, Sheila. This is great. It really sets the stage well, not just for the discussion on this panel, but even for the next one. So we will come back to the capacity building in the sense of money and skill in a moment. So thank you for that. Let me actually introduce the panel that we're going to have here. A moderated panel discussion, just to dive a little bit deeper into how do we connect across these different knowledge systems and support interaction across them. We have three folks. If you want to all come on with your cameras, Julius Francis, Leticia Marino, and Katie Croft Bell. And I'll just very briefly introduce them again. There's much more on the bio page on the event website. Julius Francis is with the Western Indian Ocean Marine Science Association's Executive Secretariat. Leticia Marino is a professor at the National University of Mexico, and she also contributed to the IPBES Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And then we have Katie Croft Bell, who is a marine explorer and a research scientist at the MIT Media Lab, where she serves as the director of the Open Ocean Initiative. Let me start, Julius, with you. From your experience with the MEAVISN, or Ocean Knowledge Initiative, and other initiatives in the Western Indian Ocean, how can we enhance this knowledge to policy uptake for developing evidence-based policymaking and evaluation? Let me start with that.
Thank you, Susan. I'll give very quickly four examples building on Sheila's presentation. The first one is that you need to have an incentive to actually get the scientists to work in transdisciplinary research. And there are two examples for that. One is the MEAVISN initiative, where all the projects that are funded through that programs are required to have a co-designing workshop as part of the implementation of the project. And then we do have a competitive research grant run through WIOMSA. It's called Marine Science for Management, and it requires integration of different knowledge systems as part of enhancing science to policy uptake. The second example is what we have managed to in our region through the UNEP hosted Secretariat of the Regional Series Program, the Nairobi Convention, to establish science to policy platform. This platform brings together different groups, different stakeholders to discuss issues of common interest. And there is a call coming from a call targeting scientists, non-government organizations, asking them to bring to the table issues that they feel need to be discussed at the regional level. And we are getting quite a number of groups presenting ideas to the policymakers, to the private sector, and the representative of communities for discussions and come out with the decisions that needs to be made at the regional level. We have also looked at if you look in regional and national policies, there are requirements, for instance, of producing national and regional assessment reports for environment, for state of the coast. All this requires you bring together different knowledge systems to be able to produce a report that captures the complexity of the in this case of the ocean. So that's another tool that we have been using in the region to integrate science for the purpose of coming the integration of different knowledge systems for the purpose of coming up with a polished recommendation. The fourth one is we have also applied different framework, and one of them is a weight of evidence approach to integrate different knowledge systems for the purpose of responding to the management question, the scientific questions, and to be able to offer solutions to the policy. And also the last one is that the marine spatial planning also provides us with another opportunity for integration of different knowledge systems.
Great, thank you. I want to come back to you later, but this is really interesting. So platforms, assessments, you know, forums in which people can talk about solutions. So that's really helpful. I want to specifically come back to you on capacity building as we transition to the next panel. But before I do that, let me just quickly say, you see on this slide here that there are actually 4 panelists. Well, unfortunately this morning, Clement Yao Mulalap could not be here. He had an emergency requirement to come up. So he just sends his apologies, but I just want to acknowledge that he was meant to be here and couldn't. But we have Leticia Merino now here, who was very much involved, or maybe still is. Leticia, you tell us, in IPBES and the integration of indigenous knowledge with scientific knowledge. I wonder, so there was a question in the Q&A as well. If you maybe could start out with saying a word about how you defined indigenous knowledge and local knowledge in that context. And then tell us a little bit more about what's that context sensitive approach that is so typical for indigenous and local knowledge systems that you used, you know, while organizing all these different communities' contributions and try to integrate that in a global assessment. Tell us how you did that. And you're on mute. Do you see your mute button on the left?
Okay, yep. I think that's the phrase of the year. You're on mute. Sorry about it. Well, I mean that seems to be a very straightforward question, and it's also a very tough and complex one. First, I mean, before the IPBES, I would say that after many years of working with what we call now socio-ecological problems or socio-ecological systems, and working in Mexico and Central America and Latin America, which are contexts very much characterized by huge inequalities, by social movements, by presence of local rights of indigenous and local people. I mean, not necessarily indigenous African Americans in Colombia, but a lot of local groups, local communities. The need to include these voices, these reflections came to me very early through the fieldwork. Going to the reflecting on the IPBES experience, I think what we lacked, and it's very difficult to get in a global assessment, it's how to produce ownership of the product. I'm talking about local communities. I mean, how to engage them in the problem definition that's very tough in a global assessment, and how do we make them promoters of the vision, or how do we make for them possible to include the findings in their claims, in their struggles. And in global assessments, I really do not know how to do it. I mean, I think the participation of indigenous leaders in these global summits, it's not enough. I think you need to, I mean, to get this ownership of the knowledge, to be able to make people use it for rule making, local rule making, or local management, or social struggles. You need to work much more closely, I would say, with communities and many problems. I mean, I was thinking all this week since I got your invitation, and how does this apply to knowledge? But two recent projects. I mean, I have worked with forest communities most of my life, most of my academic life, and working in two emerging problems in forest areas in Mexico and Latin America. One is mining, one is extractivism, and the other was COVID, much more recent. In order to develop meaningful research, what I mean by meaningful, it's research that people are able to use, and that policymaking are find also important to use very much, very often, because of the social movement. I don't think in this region of the world there would be a social environmental change without social movements. I think we need to get local stakeholders much more engaged. I mean, for COVID, I mean, in a work we had about COVID in Mexico and Latin America, we had to work through Zoom with leaders, local leaders in the Amazon, local leaders in Petén, in Guatemala, in Chaco, Brazil, and Argentina, in the Andes, in Bolivia, in different regions in Mexico. And without the different voices, I mean, problems are so different and strategies are so different in different regions. Without these voices, I mean, our knowledge would be, I think, very far from reality, very far from being meaningful. Same for the current research I'm coordinating on extractivism and mining. I mean, I came with a very academic idea about impacts on inequality, on ODS, and so on. And people are telling me, no, I mean, what we need is to know which are the how do you call, the toxic components in the water, the heavy metals present in water, and we need to have an academic statement how these relate with the pattern of mortality and morbidity we are getting in the region. So these are questions I haven't thought before, and I think I need to link my academic questions with these questions, these demands that people are making, in order to build meaningful questions from both sides, starting with a question. So I think co-production, it's a given if you want to work on socio-ecological systems. I mean, in terms of ocean, I guess it's more difficult. It's not my field, and it's a global commons, so it makes it more challenging.
Yeah, you make a great case for how important that the change in research questions that occurs as a result of this co-design and co-production. Also, really interesting comments that you and Julius made about people needing to not just have an incentive, sometimes they come with an incentive and then, you know, want to apply this knowledge to their legal struggles, their social movement struggles that they're involved in. I wonder if you can just briefly say a couple more words about what approaches do you feel actually do work? You said, you know, it's really difficult to include these very different knowledge systems appropriately in global assessments, although you tried, made a valiant approach here. But what do you feel works, and what still needs to be developed to really value these multiple knowledge systems more effectively?
I think what we need to to achieve, if possible. I mean, as one of the panelists before said, I mean, there will be unsettled disputes and incompatible worldviews, because different stakeholders, to start with, are very unequal in power and wealth terms. So, and cultural and so on. I mean, I remember a book by Melissa Leach a while ago, where she was talking about, and I think it's a great book, an old book, Misreading the African Landscape. I mean, written by her, about how different actors have very different views, and until you invest enough time listening to people, you don't see what the other mean by the reality you see in a fixed way. I think, and she said, we need to start with more humble epistemologies. I mean, or science, I mean, considering how important science is, science in these post-normal disciplines like socio-ecological issues needs to be more humble. I think we need to develop, I don't have a recipe in my practice. I think it's time consuming. You need to invest a lot of time, not just listening, but building trust. Yeah. I remember also Elinor Ostrom talking about how knowledge, or meaningful knowledge, is a commons, it's a shared resource, and how important it's to build shared visions in order to govern sustainably the resource. And trust is built through exchange, through collaborations, through working together. So I think it's a very general response, but in more concrete terms, once you have built this trust, once you have been able to sit your stakeholders at the same table, which takes time, and they have listened to each other's, I find, I mean, and based on the work of Juan Camilo Cárdenas of Universidad de los Andes in Colombia, that experimental economics games can be very important in terms of producing insights about the other people, worldview and experience with the results. The problem with ocean as a global commons, like climate or atmosphere, is the stakeholders are very diverse. The impact of deterioration that's caused by one actor is not suffered by he or she, but by other stakeholders who haven't contributed to the problem, and so on. So I think we need a lot of education in several scales. So I hope I contributed a little bit to the answer.
Thank you so much. I want to turn to Katie Croft Bell to share with us another experiment around how to integrate different types of knowledge. And before I do that, just a reminder to all of you, if you have questions to these three panelists, please send them in the Q&A function so we can get to them. We have a few minutes here. Katie, you started developing the Open Ocean Initiative in 2019, which works at that intersection of science, technology, art, and society to design and deploy new ways to understand the ocean and connect people to it in novel ways, empowering them, if you will. So I wonder if you could start telling us just a little bit about what the objectives of this initiative are and who you're engaging in this effort.
Absolutely. Excuse me. So actually, prior to Open Ocean, I spent several years as chief scientist of the Nautilus exploration program, conducting deep sea exploration around the world, and in many cases guilty of being a parachute scientist, going to a place, doing a thing, coming home, and that was it. And being at the Media Lab for actually the last 3 years, I started it in 2017, that has really allowed me to intersect with experts from numerous different fields, cultures, backgrounds outside of traditional oceanography, which has been amazing and allowed me to really step back and rethink how we explore the deep sea. So in that time, I've concluded that our limited understanding really stems from today's inefficient, expensive, and exclusive approach to deep sea exploration. The technologies are too slow. It would take, I did some calculations, it'd take 10,000 years to see the entire seafloor with current methods or more. The robotic vehicles that do exist cost millions of dollars, require large ships, and those cost, tens of thousands of dollars a day. And of course, because of their expense, the few technologies that exist are owned and operated generally by the wealthiest nations and individuals. So what we're thinking about is, how can we change this? And one component is developing low-cost sensors and platforms that will dramatically decrease the cost of access to the deep sea. So the current ship-based practices are extremely expensive, limiting the amount of volume explorable per year. So we need to maximize our efficiency by turning to scalable technologies to dramatically bring down the cost of access. The second is advancing data analysis and access. So ocean data are largely inaccessible and therefore not useful to most people. And with a potential deluge of data from a fleet of low-cost platforms, we need to get ahead of that curve and invest in AI-driven, user-friendly systems that can analyze vast amounts of data with minimal human intervention. Right now, people open up QuickTime and have a spreadsheet. That's not a scalable solution. So that we can extract global trends and understanding. And finally, and in many ways, I think most importantly, is that we need to create a diverse global community of explorers. So we need to not only increase the number, but also the diversity of those exploring. And instead of, like right now, it's largely Western white academics who are able to participate in deep sea science, which of course limits what we can do and how we can do it. We need to nurture new communities and build greater global capacity. So these are the three areas of research that we've sort of homed in on in the last 3 years, so that we can start to address the inefficiency, the expense, and exclusivity of deep sea exploration and research.
Yeah, this is fantastic, and answers, or at least addresses some of the challenges that Sheila raised in her presentation around the cost, right?
Absolutely.
It also points to this vast span of the spectrum. If you think about AI on the one hand and indigenous knowledge on the other, and how do we connect across all of these different systems? I want to pick up actually on this last piece here that you mentioned, which is the role of end users or local communities. How did you engage them in this process? Because not everyone has access to MIT, and not everyone has. So how do you do that in your project?
Yeah, so actually the very first project that we undertook was called My Deep Sea, My Backyard. And that was led by Randy Rogen from Boston University and Diva Amon from Trinidad and Tobago. And it aimed to develop long-term scientific and technical capacity in countries with deep waters that don't have the capacity to explore and study them. And so that was a pilot project to see if this concept even had any traction. And we learned 4 lessons from that. The first of which is that the local champion, that local leader of the project is absolutely critical for success. The technology has to be inexpensive, easy to use, and possible to troubleshoot. And that includes both the hardware and the software side. That the training and research methods have to be culturally relevant and accessible to the community in which you're working. It's not a one size fits all. And finally, the capacity building, and Leticia mentioned this earlier, has to be a long-term investment. You can't do it with one workshop. It takes time and long-term commitment. And so we're out of that pilot project, we've taken these things into consideration and are now working on a new series and are very much within that co-design process right now. So we have, I think, 4 different projects going at the moment. The first is user design research, which includes interviews with a couple dozen researchers and practitioners from around the world. I think we have folks in every ocean basin, variety of different cultures, gender balanced, to identify their priorities and capabilities for deep sea science and exploration, in particular the data collection platforms, the analysis, and the community engagement. We're also designing and constructing a new deep sea low-cost camera system that will be user tested with a subset of our interviewees in early 2021. So we're not only talking to people, we're also building the cameras, sending them out so they can use them. We're also working on development of some of the core capabilities that will underpin an AI-driven image analysis platform so that we can accelerate the discovery of that data using existing of which there's literally thousands of hours of deep sea video, and new deep sea imaging data that will be collected. And then finally, we're looking at global assessment of deep sea science and exploration capabilities, including both the technical and the human capacity for coastal countries with deep waters in their exclusive economic zone. So what do people have right now? What do they not have? And looking at those sort of discrepancies and then how we might address it. So we're continuing to work with all of our interviewees throughout this process. Some of them will be testing cameras, hopefully eventually a data analysis platform. And these 4 research areas will come together in coming months. So we're in the middle of this process right now to create a strategic action plan for broadening capacity for deep sea science.
Thanks, that's super helpful and interesting how use of technology focused it is, obviously. I want to come back to you, Julius, for just one brief moment. In your region, the Western Indian Ocean, I wonder what you think is needed in terms of capacity to do this kind of knowledge integration, to bring indigenous people, local groups to the table of ocean research. Can you speak just a few moments to that, and then we'll have a time for a little bit of questions.
I think the capacity that is needed is not the traditional capacity of attending classes. It's a capacity to bring the different groups together so that they can have a common understanding on the issues. For instance, what we have found over the years is if you talk to the communities and ask them what are their issues, or you talk to the policymakers and ask them what are the important issues, and the scientists, we go back and design the questions, and you find when you have done your research, you actually did not understand what they want. And so there's a problem of defining their needs, and also there's a problem of us understanding what they need. So that's where we need to find ways that will help these different groups to be able to clearly define, because that's very critical in the core design, and that's where we have also been finding that we do not. That's where the first problem starts, and sometimes they ask a question and we provide them with the data, or with the information that we think they need, but it's not what they need.
Right.
Or they ask questions and then they found that the information that they don't actually have the information, but it's how they've asked the question and how we have understood the question. So that's, for me, is the starting point. The second,
just briefly, Julius, because we're running out of time, so just keep it really brief, please.
Okay. The other important area for capacity building is what we are talking about is about the human behavior, and that's an area where we do not have capacity. The capacity is there, but working on terrestrial issues, not on marine. So that's an area that we need to invest a lot. And then the science communication part. Thank you.
Yeah, actually really wonderful. And I'm glad you mentioned sort of the soft side of the interaction all the way to the hard science or hard technology sort of interactions. I see quite a few questions, and I'm looking at my watch here, my clock, and I'm thinking, if you have access to the Q&A, I would invite our panelists to answer the questions that they feel they can best answer. There are data questions that I think are just taking us too far afield at the moment, and I want to keep us on track. So if you could do that, that would be wonderful. If you can't see them right now, we will send them to you afterwards so that we can get everyone to chime in on the answers, and then we post them on the event webpage. So do not despair. We will get to all of those questions. So if you go to the next slide, I want to turn us then, or bring us to the next panel, which is really about the issues that you all raised. So thank you all, Leticia and Katie and Julius, for being on. You can go off camera, and I'm going to invite on camera our next panelists, Erica Key, Kate Lowry, Margaret Krebs, and Jackie Cadu, and speak to this issue that has run through this entire morning already, which is how do we support and design capacity or build capacity and mobilize resources to support this type of science. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to start off again with just briefly introducing you and then asking you questions in the same fashion in which we just did that on the first panel. So Erica Key is the Executive Director of the Belmont Forum Secretariat, which is a partnership of funding organizations, international councils, and regional consortia with over 25 member organizations representing more than 50 countries and 7 partner organizations. So she will be here to speak to the funding issue, as is Kate Lowry, who's a Science Director of the Science Philanthropy Alliance. So both of them will cover that piece. And then we have Margaret Krebs, who is the Director of Leading Interdisciplinary Collaborations at the Woods Institute at Stanford University, and also the Program Designer for Future Earth's newly launched Earth Leadership Program. And then we have Jackie Cadu, who is the Executive Director of the Network of African Science Academies based in Nairobi. So Erica, let me start with you, kicking off this discussion of capacity building in the sense of funding. What we're interested in here is how to build this appropriate funding structure to foster transdisciplinary approaches that are inclusive of different knowledge systems. The Belmont Forum is committed to doing just that. We heard the call for international, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary research funders. Can you just speak a little bit from this experience that you have with the Belmont Forum's collaborative research actions, and you might want to explain what that is. You know, working on oceans, how can we build that necessary science foundation, funding foundation for transdisciplinary research?
Thanks so much, Susie. And I'm really excited to see so many names in the participant list that I recognize. I myself am a reformed oceanographer, so I feel like I'm with family today. So it's 2 parts here. We're talking about creating the funding and resource pool to be able to support something like Decade of the Oceans or transdisciplinary approaches to ocean sustainability. We're also looking at how do we ensure that there is an enabled and supported community to respond to those calls. And so I think the first point is that oceanographers and marine scientists are really well positioned to undertake transdisciplinary approaches because we generally have training across a breadth of knowledge types when we engage in at sea or coastal research. We are collaborative. Usually the ship is a very precious resource and we have to help each other out in order to achieve goals. And more you're seeing the requirement that if you're working in territorial waters, which is the predominant form of oceanographic research, you have to share, you have to engage, you have to get permission to be there. And part of that permissive process is communicating results back. So on that hand, even in a fundamental research space, well poised, but I want to recognize that what we are now calling transdisciplinary has been around for some time. So we're able to leverage, connect, and train with an existing community. So if you think about at a very large scale, something like the Jeff's Transboundary Waters program, you know, working, using the water as the boundary, not our political boundaries. To explore areas of common interest and working together with stakeholders over a long period of time, building up those relationships. At a much smaller scale, you're looking at, or regional scale, you're looking at like CETA funding of WIOMSA and our ocean sustainability call, which was very exciting. and maybe at a smaller scale, something like Eyes on the Rise, which leverage citizen science and environmental journalism to call attention to something like sea level rise. So there's already a very, let's say, a wealth of experience in working across vocabularies and across knowledge systems. So how do we do the same in a funding space? And the way we do that in the Belmont Forum is we utilize a flexible funding mechanism. So we have to draw a very broad envelope to recognize that different funding sources or different resource providers, because it's not all about money, particularly when it comes to oceanography, ships access to proprietary data, access to decision support and web services, other non-monetary forms of resources. They all come with a specific value proposition. So if you look at the canvas of potential supporters of transdisciplinary oceanographic research, it's fundamental, it's applied, it's operational, it's the energy sector, advocacy, philanthropy, private sector, indigenous organizations, conservation and management, NGOs. It's really broad. So you have to think all of those are being motivated to fund by a different concept of what is added value of the activity. So by creating a very broad umbrella, we're able to allow those different players to come together. They manage their own resources because the pooling of funds creates more bureaucracy and slows the process much more than just synchronizing funding. It also allows large programs to be able to come to the table that may not otherwise be able to do so because the policy and red tape is just too much. So we make sure that when we are crafting the call together, we go through our own co-development process in generating the call text and in building the partnerships that we need to actually put this out there and make it a collaborative research action, which is our term for funding. It's beyond an international opportunity fund. We are collaborating as funders, you are collaborating as researchers, and you're delivering an action by transforming policy and practice. So the critical need there to continue this willingness for funders to come together and support transdisciplinary, transnational activity is we have to be able to communicate back through monitoring, evaluation, learning. What was the added value? You know, did you have a technology transfer? Did you advance learning? Did you connect with communities? Did you build capacity for the next generation of transdisciplinary scientists? There's so many different flavors of added value. So I think in closing, it's just really critical to recognize and leverage what's there, to avail yourself of TD resources like what we heard from Gabrielle Bammer and from Declan earlier. They are available online. We have many on the Belmont Forum YouTube site. And we want to encourage sustainability as a career choice. So we are launching this year in June the Sustainability Research and Innovation Congress. It will be an annual transdisciplinary event to bring practitioners together with new stakeholders and innovators and allow that community to blossom and grow and learn from one another, and recognize that sustainability is not owned by academia, that it is broadly instituted through all knowledge and all career paths, and that we can come together and build an association around that together to advance that career opportunity.
I'm going to interrupt you just because we have 4 panelists and I want to get to everyone. So I'm not going to ask you a second question right now, but I want to direct the follow-up question I had for you actually right to Kate Lowry. Kate, I wonder if you can start us out with just telling us a little bit about how your alliance is different from the Belmont Forum, just so we understand what structures are out there, and what key gaps in ocean-focused funding you see right now, and how we can work on filling those.
Great. Well, yeah, I'd love to give some more context about the Science Philanthropy Alliance. We are a community of over 30 funders in the US, UK, and Canada, all philanthropic organizations and foundations that are committed to our mission of increased private funding for basic science. So we at the Alliance actually work to advise often new funders to science philanthropy to help them overcome any of the complex challenges that they have with funding ocean science. And in addition to our members who are listed on our website, and I can throw that link into the chat, we also have 5 distinguished senior science advisors who guide our work and support our mission of increased private funding to basic science. These science advisors are past university presidents and also science funding agency leaders. In terms of addressing your question about what the gaps are, you know, I think, as we've already said today, the field of ocean science really has a long way to go, both in terms of gender diversity and, even more importantly, racial and cultural diversity, to maximize the innovation, discovery, and representation that we really need to get to the ocean science outcomes that we want in the ocean decade. And I think funders really do have an important role to play here. And increasingly, the funders that we're working with are really thinking about the roles and responsibilities that they have in this. And so I would say in recent years, we at the Alliance have seen a lot of interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I'll refer to as DEI, including from many of the ocean science funders in our network. We began to feature presentations at our members' meetings last year on DEI led by experts, and this led to 2 member-organized workshops with an expert DEI facilitator for dozens of science foundation leaders in 2019 and 2020. More recently, we've started a DEI shared interest group for Alliance members, and so inclusion, which I know is one of the things that I was asked to address, is something that's really on the minds of many philanthropic science funding organizations right now. In fact, we had a screening of the Picture a Scientist documentary recently for private science funders, including some ocean science funders, and there are 10 of 12 funding organizations who were polled, so 83% said they anticipate the organization making new funding that supports DEI in 2021. If it's helpful, I can share some of the things that funders are, some of the steps that they're taking to address inclusion, since I know that's something that's important to the decade. Sure. So like many scientific institutions, even the most committed funders really don't have the problem solved yet. So some of what we're hearing that philanthropic funders are taking, at least within the Science Philanthropy Alliance, are consulting with experts in DEI to integrate best practices into RFAs and selection processes, collecting optional demographic data for PIs, but also the full project teams to really encourage diverse teams and then track and measure the progress, requesting statements from grantees to describe how they'll address DEI in science, holding grantees accountable for their efforts, you know, really turning to the scientists and the institutions to ask them to put in the work to form inclusive and transdisciplinary collaborations, funding fellowships for diverse groups of early career scientists, and finally, an example of requiring multi-institution collaborations, regional partners and capacity building, and there's a lot of emphasis on open data sharing. So I know that federal funders are already taking many of these steps, and there's continued momentum in the US at the National Ocean Science, at the National Science Foundation for Ocean Science, and even within the National Academies Ocean Studies Board. So from my perspective, I really do think that it's a great time for the ocean decade to engage funders in an inclusive approach that represents the full spectrum of stakeholders.
That's really interesting and speaks nicely to some of what we heard earlier about inaccessible data and, you know, just the capacity needed to bring people actually to the table. So fellowships and open data just seems like, please keep going. So don't go away. I want to turn us to the other meaning of capacity building with Margaret. Maybe we can start with you. You are deeply involved and have been for many years in training people in how to do this kind of work. And so I wonder if maybe based on that experience, you can start with, how do we create the right institutional conditions, the sort of, a nourishing ground for researchers to do this kind of engaged research, transdisciplinary research?
Thank you so much, Susie. I think that we have to recognize that we're in this very transitional phase, and that we need to enable what's called boundary spanning. That if you think about a researcher and all the things that they have on their plate right now, from getting up in the morning to checking email to really sponsoring a whole bunch of students and teaching, that adding yet another piece on their plate of doing this kind of research, we need this transition state. And boundary spanning, to me, is one way to provide this, what Gabrielle Bammer calls the integration and implementation. That if we have this new role within universities of someone who has both the knowledge of the research as well as the language and skills that are involved in the practitioner world, like knowing what the project life cycle is, knowing what a logic model is, being able to listen and answer the questions and ask good questions, that boundary spanning function is going to be really important. I think I would love to see, in the same way that in the 60s and 70s, we created new kinds of schools. We called them alternative schools that coexisted side by side within the regular school infrastructure, and that we need that kind of experimentation within universities that have very much a long-term investment, the funding that can support a project for a long time, because as you've described in the whole co-design, co-produce, co-implement, it's a much longer cycle. And so to provide these kinds of transition phases would be really helpful.
Yeah,
So.
that's great. You just mentioned some of those skills, to get to the meat of it, like mention a few others that you find are sort of the absolutely crucial things to have in your back pocket or front pocket or whatever. And how do we build that? Like, what do we need to actually make this happen? Since we don't have those schools yet, those alternative schools, boundary workers.
Well, I think one of the critical things, and we heard this from Gabrielle Bammer, and so maybe I can deconstruct dialogue and what that means, is that the ability to listen very deeply, to be able to voice your own thoughts and ideas and be very transparent in what your assumptions are, to be able to ask really good questions. Those kinds of conversational skills are not taught in our graduate programs, or really the ability to think together. Getting to a shared vision is very difficult work, because you really want to be able to understand multiple perspectives and then begin to get to that integration work. And there are a lot of tools out there, but they aren't part of the repertoire of most researchers. And I would refer you to this great, in fact, I have the book right here, so I'll just put it up. This book of Liberating Structures, and there's also a website that the tools are out there. And so making those accessible. And I believe also that it's very important to have a group of people that you're trained with, that you can have this kind of ongoing support and feel as if you have a common identity, that those are really important groups. And yes, they cost money, but they're essential.
Yeah, well, it always costs money not to have them, right? I mean, we fail all these
Yes.
opportunities. So, Jackie, I want to turn to you and have you speak to this skill building question as well, in particular in Africa, to hear a little bit more of that context. You lead the network of African Science Academies. You've been involved with the LIRA 2030 project and other research programs. Drawing on that experience, and maybe, you know, you've listened to this entire webinar, you've heard a lot about data accessibility and institutional barriers. Tell us a little bit about what you see as the uniquely African institutional or structural challenges to doing this kind of research for the oceans and how we can overcome them. What have you figured out?
Thanks, Susie. Maybe I think what we've learned is TD in Africa, or TD, which is transdisciplinary research elsewhere. What you encounter is similar, because I think even from leading the network of African Science Academies, science is science, be it done in Africa or otherwise. So through the engaging with the early career researchers in the LIRA program, I think three things just stand out, and it's like it keeps coming up over and over again. And it's something that we are still grappling with the finer details of what a solution-oriented position would be. But there are three in terms of time, the relevance, and silos. So I'll just speak to those three very briefly. So one time, and I think we've heard even from other speakers, is that it takes a lot of time to do transdisciplinary research. Most academia, most researchers are not built to do research like that. So it almost feels very foreign when you have really long-term planning in doing transdisciplinary research, but mainly because in doing that, you have to build relationships. Building relationships require trust. Trust takes time to earn. And most stakeholders would not have you rush that time for just the sake of the research being done. So the time aspect is something that institutions have to grapple with constantly. To overcome that is just be flexible and get to a point where you can accept that your research just initiated the awareness or the new way of doing research, and leave it at that and still be content that that is still a win in the research sector. The second thing is relevance. And I think it's Sheila who was talking about, Sophie was talking about citizen science. Most academic institutions really have a tough time in believing that science or research type of framing of things can be found outside the institutions or outside academia. So just co-production, utilizing non-research terms, terminologies, experiential science, in even as simple as formulating the hypothesis and co-designing a question that would be relevant, not just to the research fraternity, but also to the community and also to the policymakers, is something that they find really difficult, because it means the scientist has to step back and allow people to speak into what they think the scientific research issue is. But then lastly, the silos. Mostly we talk about silos in respect to disciplines in science. But what we've realized within transdisciplinary research is there are also silos in society. Silos between gender, it's called not segregation, but gender aspects of community. There's silos between the political elite versus the community, local communities. There's silos around what we see social strata, or the funders and the recipients of funding. So those silos really throws the research institution aback, because they have to deal with them. And I think our first speaker said it has to be contextualized. So overcoming those silos and being able to speak to the core of the issue and having that unified vision that I think somebody else mentioned is something that it takes an art, not just the science, to be able to do it. And it comes in that you have to bring in your emotion to the table. You have to remove your biases and cut across those boundaries, but with such humility to be able to learn. I mean, we call them institutions of it's higher institutions of learning. So just that opportunity to be able to learn something new and adapt new ways of doing research. So those three things, Susie.
Wonderful. I'm going to make a connection between what you just said, Jackie, and Kate, something that you mentioned. Time was the first key issue that Jackie pointed out. And so often funders are really not interested in just supporting time and such long time. It's much more, splashy to have a shovel-ready project or something that you can see much more, I don't know, make news out of, right? So I wonder, how is that changing in the funding communities that you're working with? Are you seeing people recognizing that weaving that fabric and investing in that time is actually what we need to speed up the entire process altogether? And you're on mute, yeah.
Yeah, I do think that we're seeing an increased recognition of that. And I really believe that transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary research are areas in science where philanthropists can make a really big impact because of how challenging it can be to get funding for these complex, very large person collaborative teams where it takes so long even to assemble the team and write the proposal. It can be really challenging to have that funded through the federal government structure. And I think I think that should be articulated to private ocean science funders. And it's one of the things that we do articulate, because philanthropists often don't like to fund things that the government is or should be funding. They like to be nimble. They like to take the long-term view. They can incorporate the flexible scientific review processes. If they wanted to, they can fund a team of scientists to write a proposal together. They can fund, they want to fund high risk but very transformative research. And they can even become sustained funders in a particular field, although they do really like to provide seed funding for projects that then can get government funding. And so my background is actually as an oceanographer and earth system scientist. And I came to the Alliance after my PhD at Stanford and postdoc at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution to work with a community of ocean science funders because I saw the huge potential for philanthropy to help in this area with ocean science. And, I was talking with a leader of an ocean science institution recently, and she talked about how philanthropy has been so important for a 70-person transdisciplinary collaboration that's led at her institution. And this leader knows the federal system very well in the US. And she said if the team had to rely on federal funding, it just would have fallen apart a long time ago because the time that it takes to assemble a 70-person team, if they had to wait for the typical funding cycle, it wouldn't have worked. But because they could build a trusting relationship with a donor, they were able to get funding, and the project has been a big success. And so I think that funders are recognizing how long it takes increasingly to assemble these teams and also to achieve the results.
Great. And Margaret, last word to you just briefly. Jackie spoke about silos, overcoming the mental silos and institutional silos. I wonder if from your experience of, what is it that gets scientists to actually cross the aisle, if you will, to other disciplines? Is it again a propensity? Is it a skill? What is it that you see people need to make that happen?
I think it's an intention that comes and emerges, and I'm not sure where but that we see this kind of new identity that is formed almost every time there's some kind of a network meeting or a training meeting, that this acknowledgement that you want to do something different and you want to be working with other disciplines, you want to reach out and focus on a sustainability issue. You want to be outward facing. That I think that's always been there, but then to actually get it affirmed and to have that confidence and identity and recognize, oh, there are other people out there that want the same thing. That once you get that, you just want to keep nurturing it. And, we've seen how important that continuation. And I love the fact that there is this Sustainability Research and Innovation Congress that is forming that's going to be really key to have that kind of opportunity to sustain and restore people.
That's wonderful. And many of you saw that Erica Key posted the call for papers right now that's out for that Congress. So to wrap up this session, I want to actually call in Sarah Moore, who is with the International Science Council as science officer there and has led as program manager the Transformations to Sustainability program since its inception, really. It is a program, in my humble opinion, that is a great example of, you know, putting our money and intention and mouth where basically where we want it to be, and to actually make it happen, build capacity, particularly in the global South. Sarah, tell us a few lessons that you feel come out of that program that does that so well. Take it away. Give us a clue of what happened in that program.
Thanks very much, Susie. And perhaps we should disclose that you've been involved in the T2S program for even longer than I have, since you're so kind to it. Could I have my first slide, please? So it's a privilege to present the T2S program in this webinar, and to tell you about some of the lessons we're learning about how to support and enable transdisciplinary research. I think this program illustrates many of the points that have been made by the panel today, so I'll just jump into it. Next slide, please. I won't give much background information on the program, but as Susie noted, the program was designed to be global, open to researchers anywhere in the world, requiring collaboration across North and South, supporting social scientists to lead inter and transdisciplinary research for sustainability. That's leaving out a lot of the detail, but let's say we had a very ambitious program design, which was quite unique at the time that it was launched in 2014. Now, the original program design and ambition, which was supported by the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA, that inspired other funders, notably the Belmont Forum and the Norface network of social science funders, to get involved. And we eventually managed to fund a second cohort of projects with a large consortium of funders. So we had a first set of 3 projects funded by one development organization, finishing up as a second set of 12 were starting off. And those 12 projects are now roughly in the middle of their lifespan. And next slide, please. So I've put the program objectives on the next slide, but I can summarize for our purposes by saying that both sets of projects aim to support collaboration between academic and non-academic partners. And how did we try as funders and program coordinators to enable that? Next slide, please. Well, one way was by very explicitly supporting a dedicated co-design phase before a call for full proposals through seed grants of 30,000 euros each to 38 teams for a period of 6 months to allow proponents to reach out to partners, to build their relationships, explore ideas, and to jointly draft research proposals. And what we found then when we launched an open call for full proposals was that those proposals which had benefited from a seed grant were much more mature, had a huge head start over other proposals. And a lot of the learning from that co-design phase, incidentally, was captured in a special issue. You see the reference to the paper, to the special issue at the bottom of the slide. And there's an open access synthesis paper in that special issue that picks out some of the very diverse forms of co-design that took place in those projects and some of the unanticipated benefits. Next slide, please. Now, part of the reason to support a co-design phase is because, as various people have mentioned that today, co-design and co-production are time intensive. And that brings us to the question of resources that we have already talked about. And I think there are at least 2 really important dimensions of this question in relation to TD research. The first is, of course, TD research takes time. We've talked about it. And the pace at which institutional structures change and adapt is also pretty slow. And what's still on offer, broadly speaking, from funding agencies who want to support TD research is still a pretty standard short-term 2 or 3 year project-based funding model, which proves to be too rigid for a lot of transdisciplinary research. And our completed T2S projects questioned whether this was responsible of us as funders and program coordinators, even ethical of us, to approach transdisciplinary research support in this way. And possible solutions in future programs might be provision for longer grants or for costed project extensions or follow-up grants of various kinds. And related to this, it's a different problem, but it exacerbates the problem of the limited duration of the research projects. It's that ending collaborations with societal partners is often quite difficult, quite tricky. Ending them abruptly, even when you know the end date of a project from the beginning, can generate a sense of abandonment and a lack of completion. And this is something that project and program design really has to try and take into account. And then the second important dimension of funding issues is who has the right to be funded. And here we did see differences between our two cohorts of projects. The first cohort was financed by a development funder with very few restrictions on beneficiaries, while the second was funded mainly by national research funding organizations, which, broadly speaking, fund academic researchers, not only, but broadly speaking. So in the first set of projects, we saw non-academic partners taking leading roles in the projects and being remunerated for their efforts. While in the second, although non-academic partners are heavily involved, the remuneration is less consistent, and it's been raised as an issue in terms of the distribution of the roles and power in the projects and the variability of non-academic partners to participate sometimes. And on a very practical note, we sometimes even have problems transferring funds to NGO partners in certain countries. Next slide, please. Actually, could you go back one? Thank you. So in terms of how we supported the projects in doing transdisciplinary research, we saw a wide variation in experience and co-production approaches within the projects, and a huge appetite for continuous learning from both the younger and the experienced researchers about what works and doesn't work in stakeholder engagement in all kinds of contexts at different moments. So an integral part of the T2S program was to facilitate the interaction and learning across the projects through workshops and meetings, through various kinds of training, through stimulating synthesis and communication of knowledge, through support for emerging initiatives, such as the Early Career Researchers School that you see on that slide. And I really can't stress that enough, that to build capacity for complex TD research and to increase its impact, research programs need to dedicate funds to these kinds of value-added activities, not just to the research projects. Next slide, please. And I'll finish just by touching really briefly on some of the big issues for funders and coordinators of transdisciplinary research. And the first is, of course, that TD research in dealing with publics of various kinds and often disempowered publics has to deal with issues of power, inequities, representation, and the role of the researcher, as Dylan McGarry was talking about earlier on, in studying or helping to bring about change and in communicating findings from research involving those kinds of partners and publics. And as funders and coordinators, I think we can't make assumptions that the ethics of these processes in this domain of research, at least, we can't make assumptions that the ethics are clear, as they're often evolving and contexts are evolving. And we've learned that project members really appreciate explicit, open discussion of these issues, and they are never out of date or redundant. The second are questions of evaluation, how we decide what to fund, assess proposals, what our expectations of transdisciplinary research are, have we found the best ways possible, the measures, the tools to evaluate transdisciplinary research. And in the T2S program, we tried to cast our net very wide in terms of what we capture as outputs and outcomes. We reflect with the researchers on what they considered to constitute impact, how they would measure themselves, and we've taken that really seriously. So we've had a careful qualitative approach that has worked well on the relatively small scale that we have in the T2S program, but which must be challenging for funders at larger scale.
And Sarah, could you just wrap up in 1 minute?
Yeah, finishing now. So to sum up, what I think we've learned from the T2S program is that funders, coordinators need to have a long-term vision and to give sustained and flexible support to transdisciplinary research, and to try to do that with care for the people involved. And you can go to the next slide. Those would have been my last words, but I leave you with a thought based on the sticky situation we're in because of COVID. And one of the questions that emerge for us now is how do we do and how do we support engaged transdisciplinary research in a virtual, distantiated world? How do you connect with people, build trust and relationships at a distance? So we're starting to learn about that now, and I think it's something that will influence how we do and how we support TD research in the coming years. So I'll just leave you with that thought and question. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Super practical and very good recommendations. Because we're a little bit behind time, I want to just get us into the wrap up of this webinar today, calling on Julien Barbier, who is the head of the Marine Policy and Regional Coordination section of IOC at UNESCO, and also the IOC focal point for the Ocean Decade. Julien, tell us about next steps, where we're going from here, what comes next, what are the calls for action coming up, and how can people participate?
Great, thank you very much, Suzanne, and thank you very much, dear colleagues, for this such a rich discussion today. I think we are learning really as we are moving forward with the decade, and all those inputs are very important to us. I think based on our discussion today, I mean, I just take maybe 3 or 4 home message. I think we need to create an incentives for really getting this collaboration underway. And of course, co-design is timely and it's time consuming and it takes a lot of efforts because you try to bring different players together who do not always speak your own language. So I think the decade is also trying to create that incentive. And it's really about not going so fast and alone, but going together and far more and having a much stronger impact. It's also providing a platform to organize this discussion. We need a space for that. And the platform is very much the decade and the different elements that we are putting in place from 2020 to 2021. The issue of funding is, of course, very important. Even though the decade is not a funding mechanism per se, it is really about aligning resources and support so that we can all work jointly together a number of common goals. And of course, the issue of capacity development is critical, and we all need to learn about this collaboration and the way to design those collaboration. The call for action is, of course, one way to start this co-design aspect together. And you will, I'm sure, be aware that on 15th of October we released the first call for decade actions, which will run for about 3 months until 15th of January. And the idea there is really to identify what are the baseline programs we want to put in place in the decade. This is not, of course, there will be several calls of actions in the course of the decade and not always at the same level. This one is pretty general. I mean, it's focusing on the 10 decade challenges and the 7 outcomes of the decade. But in the future, we will also use this call to really target specific areas or specific regions where we want to foster collaboration and, again, alignment of support. We will have a review of the proposals we will receive, and we will have our first batch of decade programs endorsed in the first quarter of 2021. And if we can now move to the next slide. And of course, you can find a lot of the information on the call on the decade website, and you can also use the website to also express your interest in specific areas and help to try to find some potential partners in this work. And this is something that the Secretariat is trying to facilitate. But there are also other ways to create this collaboration in the framework of the decade. I've mentioned the decade actions. We are setting in place a global stakeholder forum from 2021, which will be very much a virtual platform, providing a place for different communities to find their way in the decade, but also to interact and to create co-design and collaborative actions. This will be also in the form of a global conference that will take place every couple of years to also take stock on the achievements and the progress of a decade, and also address innovative and new issues that we need to address in the context of a decade. I also want to highlight the importance of national committees, because these discussions that we're trying to put in place really needs to start at the national level. And I think it's quite heartwarming that several countries around the world are now moving forward with the establishment of national decade committees, bringing together a different group of stakeholders and trying to identify what there be their contribution to the decade and what kind of actions they can actually put in place at the national level. We are also very keen to give space and empower all our partners who have been involved and be part of this story for the last 3 years. We've been working at the regional level with a lot of the organizations that have a key interest in science, in promoting the science policy and the science society interface. So we would like them to be really part of that story in the next 10 years, and we need those to come forward and take on some of the responsibilities for coordinating some of the actions at that level. And this is why we will, in 2021, put in place a process for having decade implementing partners and decade collaborative centers to really harness this potential out there and this collaboration. Also want to highlight the Ocean Decade Alliance, which is really a mechanism to find resources and for the decade. Again, I did say at the beginning that the decade is not a pot of money where that will basically fund the work, but we need to create the incentives there and facilitate the interaction. Clearly, as we've heard today, there's a need to tap on the public funding that goes into science and redirect it towards these transformative actions. But we're also very keen to work with the private funding institutions, whether those are corporate or philanthropies, and we have been working hard in setting up an initial philanthropic network to support and to think about their contribution to the decade. So this Decade Alliance will be a bit of a matchmaking process in terms of trying to find what are the needs for specific actions in terms of resources and bringing together the institutional players who are willing to commit and support science and the decade in general. But also, of course, we also want to use the decade to really design specific call of actions which can already have some pre-funding already aligned within the existing mechanisms that some of those financing partners might have.
Just
and then finally, my last slide, what's happening in the next few months and what is happening right now. As you know, we have the Decade Implementation Plan, which is our kind of a guiding document and provides really a framework for designing the actions, which is now ready and available. It is actually, as we speak now, being discussed at the UN General Assembly. And as far as I can hear, we are getting good support from member states. And I think probably by the end of the day, we will be able to announce that the implementation plan has been welcomed and taken on by member states. And then therefore we can really start the decade in a good shape and with a robust and inclusive plan. We've had the call for action, which is the first option for starting to design some of those actions. But again, there will be several more in 2021 and the following years. We will organize at the end of January, a high-level supporters event, which is pre-launching the Decade Alliance. So we're trying to get really high-level politicians, but also heads of philanthropies to be part of that process. We will roll out in the next few months the stakeholder engagement mechanism, in particular the Global Stakeholder Forum that I have mentioned. We will be able to announce probably around March and April the first batch of decade actions that have been endorsed, and those will also be communicated to the wider community. And we have also the first International Ocean Decade Conference in Berlin, which will probably be the 1st of June, and which will be followed up by a series of virtual events in the course of 2021 to really provide a laboratory for all our partners and stakeholders to work together in the design of solutions and actions. And then finally, in 2021, we have, of course, the UN Ocean Conference, which has a focus on science and innovation. And of course, the decade will be a central theme of that conference, where we also hope to trigger more commitments towards science and the plans of the decade. So with this, Suzanne, thank you very much for doing a great job again today, and to all the participants. And we take good notes of all your recommendations as we are moving forward with the implementation of a decade plan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julian. This is wonderful to see what's all lined up to come and for giving us that logistical overview of where people can chime in and get connected to the decade. So for all of you who are interested, please visit the Ocean Decade website. You can get a recording of this webinar there and find more information from all the speakers. I want to thank all of those speakers today, just excellent suggestions and recommendations. And I'm sorry we didn't have more time to talk about all of that. We will post, as Julie mentioned earlier, a synthesis report with all the recommendations on the site as well in a few weeks. So come back to visit it. And I want to just close by thanking all of you for participating, not just today, but in all the other webinars in this entire series that we had. And that means thank you for all the work that you all are doing in protecting and restoring our oceans. Your work is absolutely vital, and that will be the measure of success. So thank you all, happy holidays, and goodbye.